Hey everyone, you're watching We Had That, and today I'm going to talk about the 1990 Snare Arm Swamp Thing action figure from the Swamp Thing line by Kenner. Skin Man arrived in my collection along with a random lot of action figures that I got on eBay and became the first figure that I ever picked up from the Swamp Thing line. I liked him pretty well, so rather than get rid of him, I put him in a box of random figures and pretty much forgot about him. Several years later, I stumbled across a Swamp Thing figure and thought he'd make a good addition to my Superpowers line. Kenner had teamed up with DC Comics and from 1984 until 1986 released some of my favorite DC figures ever in the Superpowers line earlier in the 1980s. While reading about the Swamp Thing line, I learned that many fans had theorized that Snare Arm Swamp Thing from the Swamp Thing line was originally designed to be in the fourth wave of Superpowers. The Snare Arm Swamp Thing in particular does look like he could have been in the Superpowers line, especially when you consider that most of the Superpowers figures have an action gimmick that involves squeezing their legs together to make their arms do something. Snare Arm Swamp Thing has a forearm attached to a string that you can pull out to ensnare one of the unmen. When you squeeze his legs together, it retracts back into the arm. On the package, the feature is called the Vine Winch Arm. At this point, it seems the theory that he was originally designed for the Superpowers line has pretty much been debunked. But regardless, both lines are made by Kenner and are about the same scale, and Snare Arm Swamp Thing looks great standing next to the Superpowers figures. In fact, I think the entire Swamp Thing line fits in pretty well with Superpowers. Although Swamp Thing had been around in the comics since the early 1970s, and there had been a live-action Swamp Thing movie in 1982, it was the 1989 sequel, co-starring Heather Locklear, that seemed to ring in a renewed interest in Swamp Thing. Suddenly, Swamp Thing was getting a big push, with the USA Network picking up a live-action Swamp Thing TV show in 1990, which ended up running for 3 seasons. A Swamp Thing cartoon with new characters also started up around 1990, and it turned out that the cartoon was a promotion for Kenner's line of Swamp Thing toys. Unfortunately, the toys didn't sell as well as hoped, and even though there were 2 more figures released in a pseudo-second wave, the full second wave, which made it as far as Kenner's catalog for toy buyers, never materialized. In both the toy line and the cartoon, Swamp Thing teams up with his friends Bayou Jack and Tomahawk. Together, they try to stop the evil Anton Arcane and his henchmen, the Unmen, from destroying the swamps. Although the Unmen had been around for almost 2 decades in the comics, aside from being monsters that were loyal to Arcane, they were pretty different from their comic book counterparts. The Unmen from the comics weren't as much characters as they were nameless, mindless, humanoid plant monsters. But that's a tough sell in an action figure. So the cartoon and toy line had each of the villains become a distinct character with specific characteristics who would be transformed by Anton Arcane into one of the Unmen in each episode. The Snare Arm Swamp Thing action figure is probably my favorite figure in the line. He has 4 points of articulation like all of the old vintage Star Wars Stormtrooper figures. You could move him at the shoulders and hips, but not the neck. All of the figures in the line came with accessories, and this one is no exception. Snare Arm Swamp Thing comes with a monster trap that you can use to either catch one of the Unmen or give Swamp Thing to wear as a mask. Honestly, I don't think it works very well as a mask, but it was cool that the designers were trying to make the piece as versatile as they could. Overall, I think Kenner did a good job making this figure look both similar to the character from the comic book and appealing as a toy. These days, none of the figures in the line are all that expensive. There are several different action figures of Swamp Thing himself. Since he's easily the most famous character from the line, the figures are probably easier for most people to recognize, plus he's the main character, so Swamp Thing figures sell for a little bit more than the Unmen or Bayou Jack and Tomahawk. but even the various Swamp Thing figures are still relatively inexpensive. I've enjoyed picking up the line, and as I've mentioned before, they look great standing next to my Superpowers figures. Do you collect Swamp Thing figures? Do you display them with your Superpowers collection? Which figures from the Swamp Thing line are your favorites? Tell me in the comments below. Also, please give this video a like and share it on social media. If you enjoy my content, please subscribe to my channel and hit that notifications bell so that you'll be notified when I post new videos. And one last thing, if you're a fan of toys, you should know about ToyLanta, the biggest toy show in the southeastern United States, held annually just north of Atlanta, Georgia. Visit ToyLanta.com for more information. As always, thanks for watching.